Well, welcome everyone to our research presentations today. If you're catching this after the fact, you will notice that there is only one presentation today, but it's one worth listening to and one we're excited to be able to record and post for you. So Renee Duffy is here, and Renee's going to lead us in her presentation. And since there's only one, we may be a little less formal this time around. But hopefully you can enjoy and give her some feedback on the attached feedback form if you do watch this, please. Okay, Renee, we'll turn to you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Well, yes, I'm Renee Duffy, and today we're going to be talking about my most recent project, which is fulfilling the requirements of imagining knowing. So we did some work in the field of epistemology here, which is the first I've done, which was really fun and interesting to kind of find my way through it as it applies to my discipline and what I'm doing. We're going to be talking about the character reception and narrative design in the Jacob-Esau cycle. If you've been here ever listening to me another time, you've already heard me talk about Jacob and Esau, but it's what I'm drilling down into. So I took the advantage to do this. And we'll be using a narratological approach.
And you'll define that for us?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful.
So the project that I'm bringing today came out of my study of the contribution of narratives to identity formation, both generally and more specifically than in the Old Testament. The project itself is going to apply Robert Alter's scale of means in the Jacob-Esau cycle in Genesis for character analysis. I'll be following the observations of Alter in my thesis, which was an expectation that our biblical author of the Jacob-Esau narratives would be presenting Jacob as a more complex and morally ambiguous character than his brother Esau. My methodology is a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the narratological data that was gathered using Robert Alter's scale. That's just a brief overview there of what we've got ahead of us. So first, in my literature review, a brief review of kind of how I got to the point that I'm at, is that I started by researching the importance of narratives. Narratives we all kind of intuitively know are a ubiquitous part of human life because they're a necessary part of our attempt to find meaning in the series of moments that make up our life, as well as the history of the lives that have come before us, and as we think into the future. So in my literature review, I explored the philosophy of narrative through Paul Ricoeur, the role of narrative in the psychology of individual identity through Jerome Bruner, and the need for narrative for creating and preserving cultural identity through Jan Assmann's anthropological work. And then at the core of each of these works, these scholars all agree on these foundational principles, that there is, in particular, a human readiness for narrative. We saw this particularly in Bruner's work. There's something intuitive in us as humans that we both reach for narrative, that we create narrative, that we use narrative throughout all cultures and all time periods. Also, there's a human drive for meaning making that's attached to this use of narrative. Each one of us needs to make meaning out of the pieces of our life, the history that comes before us. We use narrative to look into the future, for planning, for all kinds of things. And so there's this drive that we have for meaning making. So narrative is an indispensable tool for individuals and cultures. And some of the reasons for that is that narrative links between the ordinary and the exceptional rather well, has this ability to both explain why things are the way that they are or the way that they should be, and also gives a way for humanity to explain why sometimes it's not the way that it should be, that being the exceptional. So it's that linking of the ordinary and the exceptional that it is very good at. And it brings order to what we can otherwise experience as chaos of the human temporal experience. So this series through time of one experience after another happening and being piled on top of each other would be experienced as chaos if it wasn't for our ability to use narrative to put those into an order that creates meaning. So narratology is the... Go ahead.
You had invited, maybe perhaps we could make this more of a conversation. I don't want to
Yeah,
interrupt you if you're in a
that'd be
flow.
great.
I just wrote in the feedback form, and I thought maybe I mention it here in case you want to disagree with me or push back on it. I want you're linking narrative to epistemology, which is awesome. I love this. I'm wondering if there is any true knowing that occurs outside of narrative. And what I mean by that is outside of my own story, my own personal experience, or my resonance with the stories of others. It seems like all the things that we do in knowing, the constructs that we make, somehow emerge from the primary source has to be experience. I don't know. Am I
Yeah.
talking nonsense here?
I think I see what you're saying. And I think at the heart, to be able to say that, we have to define knowing as having meaning. And information is not necessarily equivalent to meaning.
No, information is there's a gazillion bits of information out there. I'm only going to tap into that which has meaning to me. And it's only going to
Right.
have meaning to me as if it's somehow incorporated into my story, my narrative,
Uh-huh.
isn't it? Or our
Yeah.
story,
Yes.
our narrative.
And it's why when there is information that doesn't fit into our narrative, it's so discombobulating because we need it to, or we
Yeah.
or we can't accept that it's true.
I love what you're doing here, and I love the sources that you're tapping into here. We don't usually see Paul
Good.
Ricoeur in a biblical theology kind of so this is yeah, keep going. This is cool. Thank
Great.
you. And if you guys are listening later, keep listening. This is cool. This is good stuff here.
This is a lot of fun to dive into. Like I said, I've never done any of this reading or studying before, so it was all new to me. So then this kind of establishes the importance of narrative, which is why then the study of narratology is such a key study. If narratives are so important, then how do we study them? How do we understand them? What's going on in them that's producing the meaning and the knowing that is we're receiving? So narratology then is the systematic study of the structure and the theory of narrative. And I have a quote here from Mika Ball. She's a narratologist that wrote a fantastic introduction to the study of narratology. And she says in her work, the aim of textual analysis is not to account for the process of writing, but for the conditions of the process of reception. This was a really important forming quote for me as I went through this process because one of the struggles I have as a biblical scholar is as I'm reading and I read things like Focalman or even Alter, things like this. When I read these narratological ideas, sometimes I struggle with accepting that this author sat down with this, what seems to be kind of a convoluted set of requirements and wrote this piece. But instead, what we're talking about when we talk about narratology is the conditions for reception. So when we read or accept or hear narrative, how are we getting meaning out of it? And narratology helps guide what those pieces are and how they're structured.
Hmm.
One of the many potential topics within narratology that we could be looking at today is characterization. That's the one that I'm going to focus on and what I've focused on for this particular project, or the role that characters play in communicating meaning in a story. How are they developed? What's meaningful about how they're developed? How does that communicate to us? So it's helpful to begin to kind of define what a character is and what a character isn't. So, when we're looking at characters in narrative, we know that characters are not human beings, but they resemble one. This is an important distinction that they are not wholly articulated, three-dimensional, psychologically complex human beings as we are, but instead they resemble a human being only in the attributes and the characteristics that are necessary to to contribute meaning to the story. So they're not human beings, but they resemble one. Literature is written for and about people, and the people with whom literature is concerned, though, are not real. in the sense that they are made up. They could be from fantasy or imitation, or if we're talking about historical narrative, from memory. The character then itself is not the full human being represented, but it resembles that human being. It has no real psyche or personality or ideology or competence to act. See, all of these kind of three-dimensional things that sometimes we very much want our characters to have as we read, but they do not actually have. Instead, our characters are an aggregate of the data that's provided to us, the data that's provided by our author. And they are processed in relation to other characters that they appear alongside in the narratives, and also in relation to their previous selves as we move through the narrative. Any thoughts on that, Tony?
I'm wondering if it's binary, that they're saying they're not human beings, even though they resemble one. I'm wondering if it's, at least when we're telling some stories, if they are human beings not fully developed. Because the human beings that we interact with in ordinary life are not fully developed either, at least not to those of us who are receiving them. We get
Mm-hmm.
plastic versions of
Mm-hmm.
each other sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Is it any different with the story? Do we ever
Um,
get the fully developed true human being?
I think I think it is and it isn't. I think it's I think it can be the same, especially when we're considering like our current modern moment when our social media selves are highly curated or an aggregate of the information that's presented. But lived alongside another person, I think we get much, even if you never see 100%, you see more than you would see in a narrative. And so when we live alongside a person, we can have expectations of that person, and we can write narratives of the person that account for the expected and the unexpected. In a narrative, we have to guard against expecting, um, accepting the unexpected as not meaningful. Um, Sometimes people act erratically and we attach less meaning to it, worth a grain of salt, we say. But in a narrative, if they act unexpectedly, it's very meaningful. Everything presented to us is meaningful. Is that?
Right. It's there on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And other pieces are not there on
Mm-hmm.
purpose. So we will never
Yeah,
fully know Jacob and Esau. But what is
right.
presented to us as the characters called Jacob and Esau are there to give meaning to us.
Yeah, and the reason why this is important in narratology and why they spend time working on talking about it is because there have been moments in history of scholarship where an assumption of a fully orbed person has actually led to misrepresentations of it. Because we have such simplistic stories often presented to us in ancient narratives, that has led us to assume things about the characters themselves, such as anyone who is doing something transgressive is evil, like Eve. That's led to some theologies that have been unhelpful and misrepresentations. So putting up some guardrails about what a character is and isn't is valuable to a narratologist when they're examining narratives.
Wonderfully said. That was great.
Thanks. All right, so moving on then to Robert Alter, who I've taken this scale of means from that I'm going to be working with. But first, a little preview of him. In The Art of Biblical Narrative, Alter applies a narratological approach to biblical narratives specifically, and he does this within the parameters of the structures and patterns that he has witnessed and documented in ancient Near Eastern narrative, as well as other scholars have as well. And so he uses these particular structures and parameters as important for interpreting those texts. This is kind of the direction that the art of biblical narrative goes. Within the art of biblical narrative, he presents something he calls his scale of means, which I've adopted for this project. It's a scale for categorizing the various methods of conveyance of character information to the reader. The scale is arranged in ascending order of explicitness and certainty. So if we look at our scale, you can see there are 4 categories of types of conveyance or pieces of information that were given. And the lowest explicitness and the lowest certainty appears in the conveyances of actions and appearances. So whenever we're told what a character looks like or what they do, we're there at the bottom because it's the least explicit and the least certain when we're talking about the character internally, talking about motives, talking about intentions, things like this. From actions and appearances, we can only make inferences. And so these are on the bottom of the scale. Moving up the scale, slightly more explicit, slightly less, slightly more certain, but still towards the bottom is direct speech. This can be direct speech of either the character themselves or of other characters in the story about that character. Here we're weighing the claims that are being made by these characters, and the lack of certainty comes from the fact that it is always possible that speech may better reflect the occasion than it does the speaker. So there is always a possibility that what's being said is being said for the occasion, as opposed to being said for its entire truthfulness. Lies to cover up what's going on inside or misdirection are always possible. So moving further up the scale, we have inward speech or thoughts from our character. These come with greater explicitness and certainty because they represent a character's conscious intentions. So what they intend and what they think. But again, there are outside forces and other interpretations of the moment that may or may not match what the character is thinking and feeling. And then finally, our most explicit and our most certain statements about our characters come from the reliable narrator. Call these reliable narrators statements. These are explicit statements of what the character feels, intends, and desires. There are most explicit representations of the character. When we're looking at reliable third-person narratives like we have in our biblical text. So this is the scale that I'm using for this project. A bit about the methodology of how I approached it. First, you'll see the scope of the project covers the narratives that involve both brothers, either interacting or side by side. We have their birth narrative, the small but important for a characterization piece at the end of 26, recording Esau's marriages and the reason for his marriages. We have Jacob's deception, of course, and then we have the brothers' reunion. And you'll see that I've divided these groups. I've divided them according to the flow of the narrative, which after Jacob's deception, there is a separation of the brothers for some time in which we don't have any character development of Esau, but we do of Jacob. We have significant character development. So not including those chapters where Esau isn't present, but dividing them for some of the analysis so that we can compare before and after. And you'll see that as we get into the data. So the process that I followed was first I categorized each verse in these passages, the Jacob-Esau cycle, by type of character information that's being presented. Now, admittedly, this is an imperfect approach. We're dealing with words and literature and trying to come at them quantitatively, and that's always going to be a bit of a mismatch, and so we have to take that into consideration and do the best we can. So I chose, instead of counting individual statements and having to make decisions about what makes an individual statement and how many statements are in a verse, instead I chose to count verses that contained each type, so that in effect, what I come up with is less about the number of times something happens, and it's more about the space that it takes up. So we're going to see how much space is taken up by the least explicit statements and how much space is taken up in our narratives by the more explicit statements. Again, it's imperfect, but as a result, what I do is I only draw inferences from the greatest differences, not from the smaller, more minute differences. We may observe those, but those aren't really the places where we're going to draw the significant inferences. Those are going to be the more separated. This is
Right.
admittedly kind
Oh,
of a
quick
muddy
question.
thing, so if you had any thoughts or questions, I welcome them.
Yeah, I'm curious. Are you using the English text here or the Hebrew?
I used the English text, but then you'll see as I moved through it, I did word study in Hebrew for some places where it wasn't clear or it was ambiguous.
The other thing I was wondering was I was a little surprised you said you were using verses, given that they're not original to the text and were added late medieval period. But I
Mhm.
sense what you're just trying to do is just break down the text, even if it's artificially, into
Yes.
units so you can do better analysis. Is that the reason?
Yes, exactly. Because if I had decided to try to pinpoint individual statements and try to quantify statements, then that wouldn't have been useful. But that requires a whole nother system of how do you decide what is one statement or two statements?
Yeah.
If the narrator tells me two facts about a character, is that one statement or is that two statements? That sounded way above the pay grade of this particular project. And so I decided to look at it like you're saying with this, they're artificial, but they do just kind of give you more of an overview or a map. Like I said, like how much space is it taking up? Sometimes that's a thing that we talk about in biblical studies, like in kind of this strange, muddy way.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, a few considerations that I had to make as I moved through here before you look at the numbers so that you'll know kind of what's baked into them. These are some considerations made during that data collecting phase. So because analyzing language requires interpretation, this project required me to make both interpretive choices, to deal with ambiguous cases, and also to figure in the treatment of God's own speech in the narratives. So I'll begin with a word study that I did on the Hebrew word tam from tamam. So Genesis 25:27 provides us a rare narrator's comment describing Jacob as an ish tam, or it's usually translated a peaceful man. That's what we're going to see in the English translations when we read it. However, the statement is showing up in the midst of other low explicit statements about actions and appearances. So there are two statements about Esau that are low, this one Ishtam, and then one more statement about Jacob that's also low explicit, low certainty. And so that raised questions for me about whether this peaceful man is actually a reliable narrator's statement about character, or if perhaps there was something else going on in the translation that was masking it fitting more into the appearance and action category. So briefly, the Hebrew word tam here that's translated peaceful derives from tamam, which means to be complete or perfect. It only occurs 5 times in the Hebrew Bible. This, of course, is one of them. Then there are 2 identical statements in Song of Songs with this word in it, and 2 identical statements in the book of Job with this word in it. In Song of Songs, tam is used as a lover's description of his beloved, as in being perfect or complete. It's suggesting perfection that is anchored in her beauty. Here she's compared to a dove. But ultimately, what he's expressing is approval of her whole being, her as a person, which includes her beauty, amongst many other things. In English, the sentence is my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. So he's listing many things in order to express her total perfection. In English, we might call her, the total package, kind of an idea. So then in Job, we see God is the one using tam in his list of character judgments of Job. It's translated usually as blameless. It says, "For there is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Again, he says this twice about Job in the exact same list. So once again, we have full, whole character judgments of people, not low level, only action and appearance judgments. Because both of them use that for that multi-dimensional direct character description, I determined that this Jacob description in Genesis 25:27 should actually be read as an intentional narrator's characterization. And that's noteworthy. In some ways, we look at that and go, well, yeah, you would have got that from the English. You could have just moved forward. But it's very rare in these narratives for the narrator to do this. And so I wanted to be sure that it fit. So it does end up helping us significantly.
I
Um,
imagine it would even be more significant here in a prose context than it would be in a poetry context, where a bit of hyperbole might be expected, but in a prose context, maybe not so much.
right. Yeah, exactly. One other thorny issue was how to handle God's speech. And with that, I'm also including the patriarchal blessings. So Isaac's blessing of Jacob and Esau. In these narratives, we have both happening. We have speech that's directly attributed to God in his response to Rebekah's prayer. And we also have Isaac blessing both Jacob and Esau. Both carry inherent certainty, just like the narrator's comments do. This is because, of course, we hold to the truth that God is omnipotent, so his words will carry complete certainty. And in Old Testament narrative, these blessings of the patriarchs and on their sons is handled similar to messages spoken by prophets. Isaac himself treats this blessing as binding and irrevocable in the narrative. And so we assume explicitness and certainty in those words as well. Alter does not explicitly address this characterization complexity in his work, leaving me to resolve it for my project. So what I decided is to leave them categorized as the less explicit direct speech category. And that is because they are not speaking in either of those moments of the brothers imminently, of them in that moment. God's speech to Rebekah is about nations, and Isaac's speech is about what they will become in their nations. And so I felt like that fit better, not giving it the weight that a reliable narrator's comment would have, but I could see how one could go either way. So as I present, you get to see that that's baked in to my results. Those are not being categorized as explicit and certain, where another, if you decided to, that would change kind of what we're looking at.
Yeah, I appreciate this. That's good analysis. It also occurs to me that any God talk is coming to us mediated by the human narrator anyway. So
Mhm.
we've
Yes,
got to deal with that.
had to deal with it, right? All right, so I have a couple of graphs just to show you how the data works out. This graph is showing data from all of the narratives, so they're not divided by before and after. Jacob's time in Gerar. This is just all of our narratives together. And it groups them according to the type of conveyance from Alter's scale. So we can see in our little clumps, we have a clump for action and appearance. We have a clump for direct speech. Then you see a missing clump for inward speech. There actually does not appear any inward speech, any thought in these narratives. Alter observes that that's actually really a rare thing to see in the text. It's almost always conveyed via direct speech. But it does exist, and so it is one of the categories. For this set of narratives, it doesn't exist. So you'll see in the rest of my data that's just dropped out. Inward speech won't be visible to us anymore because there isn't any. And then finally, the comments that are made by the reliable narrator. Some first insights from this data, we can see that most character information is conveyed through these least explicit means, just as a whole, and that reliable narrators' comments are rare, especially for our central character, Jacob. Amongst those bars, he only has two. One of those is one I had to look into and double check on, right? It's that rare. Whereas for our other characters, we see a few more. Not a lot more, but a few more. So overall, it's relatively rare to see a comment given by the reliable narrator, even though it is the most explicit and the most certain on the scale of means, which we may intuitively expect to see more of, but that's not the way that these narratives work or how our authors present these characters. Here we have another graph that again shows all narrative totals together, but this time they're grouped by individual. They're grouped by character. So you can see also of the comments made by any individual character, you kind of get an idea of the amounts comparatively of what is happening for that character. From this comparison, we can see that character information for Jacob and Esau takes up the most space in the narrative, unsurprisingly. And when we compare them to the other, less significant characters of Isaac and Rebekah. However, significantly more statements about Jacob fall on the less explicit and less certain end of alter scale than any other character. And when we look at the least important characters, Isaac and Rebekah, they have significantly fewer overall comments about their character, but proportionally much higher instances of the most explicit and most certain end of the scale. So when the narrator does bother to tell us something really, really specific and certain, it's usually about Isaac and Rebekah, and occasionally Esau, but very, very rarely about Jacob.
Hmm.
This is my last chart for you. This is so that we can do some comparison between the before and the after narratives. So you'll see the first group is the narratives of Jacob that happened before 27:9 when he departs to Gerar. And then we can compare that to Esau before 27:9. And we see that they look comparable. There are more reliable narrator comments for Esau, but overall, they're not that different before. And when we jump to after Jacob's time in Gerar, here we have Jacob after 27:9, not much different from before. But when we compare that to Esau after 27:9, Esau's overall numbers drop down more like Isaac and Rebekah's numbers, more like a side character, less central. So there is similarity in the quantity and even quality of character statements about Jacob and Esau early, but that does change dramatically when we move to their reunion narrative. Okay. When we consider then this data that's collected across the narratives, we can see why readers lack certainty about Jacob's moral character.
Hmm.
I think most of us have had the experience of reading the Jacob narratives and not really knowing what to make of him. In these narratives, the reader is forced into forming their own evaluation of Jacob because they're given less explicit and less certain information about him than they are about the other characters. It may be that they are nudged in a positive direction by the reliable narrator's peaceful man statement in 25:27, but overwhelmingly as a reader, we do not know for sure what to make of Jacob when he departs from his family. In the earlier narratives, we're given a great number of explicit statements about Esau, or I'm sorry, a greater number of explicit statements about Esau than about Jacob, but still very few. The greatest number of explicit statements are given to us about Isaac and Rebekah, the least central characters. All of this data confirms my thesis that the author intends to present a simplified Esau compared to a more complex and more opaque Jacob. To do this, the author must give the most explicit information about the least important characters, which is contrary to what we may intuitively expect. Instead, the author insists on the reader expending more effort in understanding and evaluating the main character in light of other less central characters. As Jacob's character takes more of the spotlight during his time in Gerar, the author's treatment of Esau also changes. In the narratives before 27:9, we're given almost the same amount of less explicit information on Esau as we are on Jacob. However, once Jacob's narrative branches off to his time in Gerar, his character development supersedes the comparison with his brother. So when the two reunite, the amount of information about Esau drops down like that of a non-central character, like Isaac and Rebekah. In this narrative, even though it's about the reunion of the brothers, we're left evaluating Jacob based on his earlier self rather than being invited to continue to compare him to Esau. Any thoughts on this section? These
Oh,
insights?
so much good stuff here, Renee. You're really getting us thinking. I'm going back to your earlier statement that characters are not human beings, although they resemble them. And that's probably true to a greater or lesser scale. At the end, Jacob is more complex, but perhaps feels more human as a result.
Mm-hmm. Which makes us
Whereas,
uncomfortable.
or maybe not everybody,
Maybe.
maybe he feels more real.
Maybe. I'm thinking about your comment in whether information fits into our narrative. And not all of Jacob's information fits into the narrative that we may be expecting.
Yeah, but that's true of all of us.
Mhm.
Therefore, when I read Jacob, I feel like I know him better than I know Esau.
Mhm.
Esau is so generously kind at the end that I would aspire to be like him, but I understand Jacob better.
Yeah, and we get so little information about Esau in the end. I wonder if he really is that kind. I don't know.
We get an episode.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we do.
yeah. Oh, you got me thinking, which is a wonderful
Great.
outcome for this kind of presentation. Yeah, we want to
Outstanding.
we want our
Well,
research to provoke thoughts, and yeah, not sure what
great.
I'll do with it, but I will probably be pondering as I'm mowing later on.
Great. Well, let me just wrap up a bit of these
Sure.
conclusions, just to confirm that the analysis I've done does confirm my thesis. That Jacob is presented as a complex and ambiguous character compared to Esau, who is simple, or sometimes in literature we say flattened character. This is because biblical narrative compels deeper engagement with Jacob's character than it does with Esau. And this is right on par with Robert Alter's assessments of biblical narrative that often we're not told explicit information because the point of biblical narrative often is to invite us to wrestle over and over again, to re-engage and to be a participation in these biblical narratives, um, in the not the interpretation, in the analysis, in the moral wrestling that comes with life. So this aligns then with Alter's observations about biblical storytelling and the structures and the methodology that they use.
And the only last thing that's occurring to me here, of course, is that Jacob's character has not only more weight in his narrative, but has more weight in the whole uh, narrative, the literature of the Old Testament, and therefore the complexity presented here. His character becomes somewhat that of the people who take his name.
Mm-hmm.
And, therefore, how he's presented here is going to be somehow symbolic of how the people are presented henceforth. And perhaps there is a beautiful parallel there where the people of Israel present the same kind of complexity and ambiguity
That's the
and
primary observation that led me to this dissertation topic, this idea that Jacob becomes Israel. That's a big deal. And
yeah,
yet, what do we have to say about the Jacob narratives and who he is and what's happening there? My own experience has been a rather simplified explanation of it, and I feel like it deserves more. And so that's where I'm going.
it probably also reinforces the other side of you. Esau becomes the father of those against whom Israel had to defend itself or was
Mhm.
hostile in later years. And the
Mhm.
fact that he is presented in simplified and largely positive terms is another unexpected.
Now, not largely positive. I didn't say that. He gets explicit comments, but they're often that he hated his birthright. They're often
Okay,
the
good.
reliable narrator's comments are not overwhelmingly positive. He
Okay,
took he took
okay.
wives to spite his parents.
I'm thinking of that last story where he's the
But
peaceful
then,
one. Yes,
yeah,
but not the whole narrative. Yes,
not the
okay.
whole narrative. Yeah, fascinating.
It is fascinating. Thank you. This
You're
is
welcome.
exactly what we want to do. And the fact that you were able to take a course in imagining knowing and do a project that is so relevant um, to your field and relevant to really what you're digging into and give us a way of looking at it epistemologically, I think is beautiful. So
Thank you.
I'm
Appreciate
glad
that.
Alter was proved to be so helpful in that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it was a good mechanism to use for this. Yeah. Thank you, Renee.
Great. Um, is it okay if I ask a business question?
Yeah, well, I'm going to stop the recording.